So if we pick up where we left off when we were doing it together, remember Jesus has met them along the way. And he invites them to acknowledge simply what they're thinking, what's going on. They are to notice the kind of non-spiritual desolation, this negative kind of experiences, the sorrow at Jesus' death, right? So then he asks them, so then he says, well, what sort of things, right? So he's inviting them at that point to relate, to tell him everything. Tell me what's going on. And so that the habit, I said earlier, relate is connected to the, helps us to do the name part, right? So trying to name what spirit's at work. Of course, we can notice that part of the reason why Jesus is probably asking them to tell him about it is because they're struggling with that, right? They don't know what to think about all these things. They don't know what spirit's at work within themselves interiorly, right? And so, but they do that. They begin to relate and tell Jesus, right? The things that happened to Jesus, and he was a mighty prophet in deed and word before God, right? He seemed to have been sent to us from God. But then he is sentenced to death and crucified, right? So the thoughts they're relating is just the facts of what's happened, right? That Jesus went through crucifixion. So do those thoughts tend us toward consolation or desolation, thinking about Jesus being crucified? More towards desolation, right? It's this negative experience within. So they continue, and it says, but we are hoping that he'd be the one to redeem Israel. Besides all this, it's now the third day. So what desire are they expressing to Jesus at that point? What were they hoping? That he would redeem Israel, right? That this man would be the redeemer, that God had sent him to redeem them, right? Regardless of whether they understood redeemer to be, him being God and redeeming us from sins or just, saving us from the Romans, still he was being sent by God, right? To redeem them. So, does that unfulfilled desire, we were hoping he'd be a redeemer, but now he's been crucified, it's unfulfilled. Is that on the level, is that consolation or desolation? That's desolation, right? Their hopes seem to have been destroyed. Non-spiritual or spiritual, do you think? Ultimately, it's going to be connected to spiritual, right? Because they were hoping he would be the Redeemer. And God is the one sending the Redeemer. But do they understand everything about Jesus? Yeah, there's going to be some normal non-spiritual as well, right? So oftentimes, we'll find this is a principle as well, is that the spiritual and non-spiritual can be connected to each other, right? And sometimes things that happen in the non-spiritual part of our life can affect our relationship with God, right? And so this is the same kind of thing that can happen here. So then they continue, and they continue to relate, and they explain, what the women, that they seem to have not found his body, and so, they're astounded, they're confused. Those are the kind of feelings they're relating. Maybe there's some hope there, maybe there isn't. We don't really know what to think, right? There's just this interior, they're not at peace interiorly, overall. So do you think those kind of feelings tend toward consolation or desolation? The kind of confusion and that would lead to desolation, but there's a possibility of some hope. So that could possibly lead to some consolation, right? Non-spiritual or spiritual, do we think? Ultimately, there can be some spiritual because it's related to, is this the Redeemer that God has brought? If he is alive, maybe he is, So that would be on the level of a relationship with God. But of course, as I mentioned, there's always going to, we can't artificially disconnect ourselves from our different levels of our heart. We only have one heart. So we can experience things on multiple levels. So then, now Jesus is going to speak to them. How foolish you are, how slow of heart to believe all the prophets spoke. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer? And he begins to use Moses and the prophets, the scriptures, to interpret to them, help them understand what had happened, why Jesus needed to do that. So what habit is happening here? Receiving, right? Because now Jesus is speaking to them. So they're receiving from him. He's responding particularly to the thoughts, the feelings, the desires that they shared. He's going to directly address those things, right? Here's why what happened to Jesus had to occur. And then I ask, what does Jesus use as a source of the good spirit, right? How does he help them to recognize, or they may not recognize it at first, but how does he help reveal the good spirit from God? Moses and the prophets, the scriptures, right? Yeah, the Old Testament scriptures is what he's using. What kind of consolation do they experience? And it's not mentioned right there in that passage, but later on in the passage. So did anybody find that? It's some kind of interior experience that they have. Later down in the passage it says, they said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the way and opened the scriptures to us?" So while he's explaining, it's not just an intellectual endeavor. He is reaching down into the very core of their heart, and they are beginning to experience God's presence, his love, his care, his concern for them. Do they know it yet? They don't know it yet. They don't even know it's Jesus talking to them. But this is happening, this experience of a consolation is happening without them even knowing yet. So it continues and says they get to the village, and he asks them to stay with us. So what habit happens here? They'd been receiving from Jesus, and now they kind of go back to a previous habit. They go back to the habit of relate. Now they're telling Jesus another desire, right? We want you to stay with us, right? We don't know who you are or really what's going on, but we're experiencing something within, and we want this to keep going. So one of the principles of the habits of relational prayer that we learned at the last one is that these are habits. They're not a method where you've got to do this step and then this step and then this step and this step. Is that relationships are much more natural than that, right? So you may go back and forth, right? So like in your prayer, you're talking to God and then you're quiet and you allow him to speak. And then you talk to him again and then you're quiet. And then, So we're back to the relate step, designed for him to stay. So this habit, once again, helps with what part of the discernment? The name part, right? There's still, because right now at this point, has it become clear in their mind what spirit's at work? They're not yet sure yet, right? They don't know it's Jesus yet. So it says he stays with them, and while he's with them, that's when he celebrates the Eucharist, right? He breaks the bread, and it says with that their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. He vanished from their sight. And then now, that's when they finally make the comment, "Were not our hearts burning when he was opening the scriptures to us?" So what habit occurs in this passage? When they relate to Jesus, they want him to stay, then they're going to receive more. They're going to receive more from Jesus, right? And not only they're not only receiving teaching, but they're receiving him, right? Of course, they're going to be receiving the greatest kind of him in his real presence in the Eucharist, right? They're receiving from him. And they finally recognize who he is, right, in that. So which discernment step are they now able to do?
It looks like they're acting.
Yeah.
They're willing to, they're open to the scriptures.
Yeah, they're open. So you're right, it will lead them to act here in a moment. But at this point, they're able to name what's been going on, right?
Oh, okay.
Right? They're able to name that this is Jesus and that he was the one at work all along. And they're able to name that experience of their hearts burning within them earlier. Now they know what that was. They can recognize, that was Jesus. We didn't even know it. And this is really important because we'll find that some experiences of certain consolations that God gives us, we may not know it is him. Not because he hasn't given it to us, but because we haven't named it as such. We didn't realize what was going on, right? So they finally now can recognize God's voice. And you'll notice the two ways they recognize him. They recognize him through prayer, these habits of prayer that we're doing. And they also recognize him in sacrament, right? Because of the Eucharist, right? So prayer and the sacraments are the main two ways that we receive God's grace. So it says, now we have it says they set out and they return to Jerusalem. They find everybody gathered there, and they say the Lord has been raised. They learn that the Lord has appeared to Simon, and then they recount what had taken place on the way and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. So what habits is this? This is respond for sure, right? They respond by going back and sharing the good news, evangelizing the others as to their experience of the Lord, right? The discernment step is act, right? And you'll notice that the consolation they receive, that experience of the Lord, empowers them now to be able to go and do that, to go and act.